by Margaret Mead. Let's say those words together.
Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. That be us, Unitarians and Universalists and Unitarian Universalists. For our numbers, historically, have always been the teeniest, tiniest percentage of the U.S. population. And even smaller if you were to count our U and UU numbers of adherents in the entire world. One of the most popular spots in our building is in the front at the poster of 100 famous Unitarian Universalists, of which you'll find a copy on the front of your order of service, but you can't really read that one. But you could read the little booklet that Mark has created for us with the 100 Unitarian Universalists, and is giving that to us for free. And I think it would be great to make a little contribution to the congregation. That's what he's done in the past. And I know I have bought a number of them and given them to my friends and my family, who were pretty astonished about the UUs that are so famous. So we might want to consider picking up one of those little notebooks, brochures that Mark created for us. Why is this so popular? For good reason. For such a relatively small faith tradition, the percentage of notables in literature, education, the arts, science, politics, social justice, and more have been members or Unitarian Universalists of Unitarian Universalist congregations, or what we like to call kindred spirits. In other words, they share a lot of our values. Even if you look at that poster a dozen times, it's easy to come back and be astounded once again about who we are. Many of our newer folks are even more surprised. So beginning today, I'm glad we're going to begin a series of sermons, one Sunday per month, to explore who these folks are and others who are not on the poster. There are still more. How they're connected to our faith, and thereby how they're connected to each of us and we to them. And why knowing this is so important. In our description of the service today, I had asked the question, so what does it have to do with Frankenstein? And I'll answer that later. So let's just do a little math first. Just how big or small are the Unitarian Universalists in measure to the rest of the world? In 2008, there was a survey to determine the number of adherents to various religious faiths and faith traditions in the United States. Only 0.03 of the survey's respondents identified themselves as Unitarians of some sort. That's only 3 in 1,000 people in the whole U.S. But get this, even that number was much larger than the actual total membership in our congregations, which was then 0.01%. 1 in 1,000, 0.1% of the population of the United States. There are a number of reasons for the discrepancies between the two numbers. Apparently, a lot of people consider themselves Unitarian Universalists. Perhaps they visited one or more times to our congregations, or maybe they visited here a number of times, and they resonated with our principles and sources, felt welcomed and home here, but they never wanted to commit to membership. This concept of belonging or becoming a member on the liberal edges of religions tends to be a little fuzzy, where we might have a stronger sense of individualism, fewer expectations of membership, and far fewer rules than what are found in more conservative faiths. Finally, access can also play a huge role. Consider how few and far apart are our UU congregations. Some states there may only be one UU congregation, maybe 2 in the southern states. Of course, whenever you are looking at statistics of any kind, you have to ask yourself, who gathered the numbers and what are the criteria? Why are they doing this? At the end of 2019, just this last couple months ago, the UUA counted by our own certification process that our membership now stands at 154,704 adults. Counting registered children and youth at 38,116, our grand total of children, youth, and adults now stands at 192,820. When I was in Washington State, I used to like to say there's that many Lutherans in the state of Washington. Now let's look back at the year 1961 for a telling comparison. We had almost an identical number of congregations across the United States. Then, 1,035. Today, 1,029. Not a lot of difference. Just over 1,000 congregations. However, our total membership in 1961 was 229,103, opposed to 192,820 today. The biggest difference is the number of children and youth declined, dropping off precipitously from 1971 or 61, 77,000, 61, today 38,000. Of course, you probably know, you're probably well aware that that's pretty much the case for most of the mainline Protestant congregations. We just don't have that many youth and young adults and children coming to services. In reality, our faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism, now is holding a slight growing pattern. As some folks have come to realize, we really do have the good news. When they look around what's happening in the United States today, they're disappointed in the faiths that they thought that had supported them. So now they're looking for something else. And so we have visitors all the time, which is our good news. It may be good news that 1 in 3 in 1,000 adults identify in some way with our tradition. But few people actually know who we are. Our principles, or our sources, or our illustrious history, or even the people in our congregations are not that familiar. One of the serious drawbacks to the fact that we have so few children and youth is we now have so few people teaching Sunday school. You teach anything, you know you learn as much or more than your students do. So when you don't have children and youth in Sunday school, you don't have adults there teaching those things who then come out of that experience as well, being informed about their faith tradition. Here at UUFLB, over the last somewhat more than a year, in worship we have explored, one Sunday a month, our 7 principles and our 6 sources. And many of us enjoyed a mini-series here on UU history, or a video series, 6 of them. So now we're going to time travel to discover our roots, so to speak, and looking at our famous and maybe some infamous Unitarian Universalist folks. And now to see who just more of them than 100 made a difference. Not only were these differences for us alone, honestly, the differences that they created are for the world. This is Women's History Month. So I'm going to begin with a pretty impressive list of you and you and you women. I have chosen ones that you might recognize, even though we have many, many more who are also important, and some who are not familiar to you at all. I'll bet as you learn who they are and what they did, you're going to say, oh my goodness, I'm not surprised. They are our soul sisters. When you know, my goodness, that's your favorite author, or that person invented something that I use, and so forth and so on. Honestly, there are so many that I want to share with you, that for the sake of time, I've only listed ones which you might be more familiar. I'm going to show you a photo or an image of that woman and tell you just a tiny bit about them, or else we'll be here tonight. To make it easier, the list is alphabetical, and of course, as Pam knows, we switched the alphabet on that. But now I think we've got it in sync, and so I'm really glad to be able to do this with you. I also need to let you know that just as we said, there are many people either who think of themselves as UUs, or have associated with UUs, or share our values, or possibly have worked with us in a variety of ways. So are some of the women on this list. I'll try to identify them as I can as members, or in some way our kindred spirits, or simply we claim them and they were never UUs. This has been a real learning experience for me. Of course, as a minority faith tradition, we want to know who these folks are and be inspired by them. And we want to share their names with others. But remember, be a little cautious. First one we have is Jane Addams. Jane Addams was born into an affluent family in Illinois, but comfort and leisure did not suit her. After spending much of her early life searching for outlets for progressive work, Adams became a reformer. In 1889, this led her to found Hull House in Chicago with a group of like-minded reformers. From the walls of a spacious, abandoned mansion, she and her colleagues created a sanctuary for immigrants who wanted to both settle and to thrive in the city. She attended All Souls Unitarian in Chicago and the Ethical Culture Society there for many years. If you don't know the Ethical Culture Society, it is basically a Jewish humanist group, and they are still thriving in New York City, and they are part of the Unitarian Universalist Association. For many years, she was a lecturer there, and she still retained her membership, however, in her Presbyterian congregation as well. Margot Adler, some of you may know her as a longtime correspondent for NPR. She's also a recognized authority and longtime practitioner of neo-pagan spirituality. Heard often on All Things Considered and the Morning Edition. She reported on a variety of subjects, among them the Ku Klux Klan, the AIDS epidemic and the 9/11 attacks, Hurricane Sandy, and the Harry Potter phenomenon, as well as the natural world. Her most well-known book is called Drawing Down the Moon, and it's really a neat read. She was a member of the Unitarian Church of All Souls of New York, a member of the Covenant of UU Cups, and a frequent speaker at national and regional Unitarian gatherings. Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women and other books, daughter of the Transcendentalist Unitarian Bronson Alcott. Louisa spent most of her life in Boston and Concord, Massachusetts, where she grew up in the company of Transcendentalist Unitarians Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, and Henry David Thoreau. Susan B. Anthony, women's rights activist who played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement. Anthony was raised as a Quaker, but her religious heritage was mixed. On her mother's side, her grandmother was a Baptist and her grandfather a Universalist. Her family attended services at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Rochester. If you go there, there's a long hallway, all kinds of things in which she was involved, along with the other suffragettes. When Susan B. Anthony returned home from teaching in 1849, she joined her family in regularly attending the Unitarian services. She remained a Unitarian for the rest of her life, but she was proud of her Quaker roots and continued to describe herself also as a Quaker. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross. She grew up in a Universalist family in Massachusetts, and she worked on the Civil War battlefields, helping wounded soldiers, and for this she was called the Angel of the Battlefield. After the war, she traveled to Europe. She became involved in the international community of the Red Cross. When she returned, she began the Red Cross here to respond to the crises and natural disasters like the Civil War. Barton was also a suffragette, but it was never her main priority. She advocated for the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to African American men, but not to women. Diane Carroll was an actress, singer, a model, and an activist. She rose to prominence in some of the earliest major studio films to feature black casts, including Carmen Jones and Porgy and Bess. And she transcended racial barriers as the star of Julia, the first American television series to chronicle the life of a black professional woman. Oh, how I wish I could tell you she was a Unitarian Universalist, but no. She was a founding member of the Celebrity Action Council, a volunteer group of celebrity women who served the women's outreach of the Los Angeles Mission, working with women in rehab from problems with alcohol, drugs, or prostitution. She grew up singing in the choir of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, and it was in one of their churches where her memorial was formed. As an avid activist, my only guess was, I scoured the internet for these people. As an avid activist, my guess is because she attended the Student Nonviolent SNCC Coordinating Committee, which met in the Unitarian Church, of course. So, we go on to Rachel Carson, author of Silent Spring, which condemned the indiscriminate use of pesticides, especially DDT. I'm afraid we've only claimed her as well. But she also claimed herself, she didn't claim herself as a religious humanist, but you could, from her activism in the environmental movement and her reference often to our transcendental ancestors, deduce that was her spiritual orientation. We sure have a lot of Sunday school rooms named after her in our Unitarian Universalist congregations. Cher, singer, actress, and television personality. It'd be so fun to tell you Cher was a UU, but alas, I couldn't find anything to connect her to our congregations. However, she had many philanthropic endeavors, including support of health research and patients' quality of life, anti-poverty initiatives, veterans' rights, and vulnerable children. Beginning in 1990, Cher served as a donor and the national chairperson and honorary spokesperson for the Children's Craniofacial Association, whose mission is to empower and give hope to facially disfigured children and their families. And Cher is a donor, fundraiser, and international spokesperson for Keep a Child Alive, an organization that seeks to accelerate action to combat the AIDS pandemic, especially for children and families with HIV/AIDS. So I think we just assumed she was a Unitarian Universalist because that's the kinds of things we do. And she probably attended church here or there, maybe signed a guest book when she arrived or something else, and then her name popped up on all these lists. But as much as I could find, no, not actually a member of our congregation or somebody connected with any particular group in our congregations. Lydia Maria Child was a Unitarian. She was an author, an abolitionist, a reformer. When a group of Unitarians founded the Free Religious Association in 1867, Maria discovered their viewpoint agreed with her own. She attended the meetings regularly during her stays in Boston. She published her own eclectic Bible of quotations from the world's religions, Aspirations of the World, it was called. Her motive is to do all I can to strengthen and enlarge the hand of human brotherhood. She wrote a groundbreaking book, an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans, in which she condemned slavery, pointing out the contradiction of Christian teachings with the moral and physical degradation that slavery brought upon the slaves and the overseers alike. And she also there addressed miscegenation. She described Unitarianism, even though she was a Unitarian, a mere halfway house where spiritual travelers find the might to spend the night, but where they grow weary of spending the day. I think she just didn't think we were spiritually exciting very much. And at the time she wrote that, it's probably true. She also wrote the song Jingle Bells for Thanksgiving. But as we know now, it has become a favorite song for Christmas, which we all sing. Emily Dickinson was a transcendentalist poet, and she was inspired by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a famous Unitarian minister. However, she was brought up as a Calvinist and attended services with her family at the village of Amherst First Congregational Church. While she struggled with faith and doubt, she was not a UU, even as she corresponded her whole life with many of us. Dorothea Dix, crusader for the reform of institutions for the mentally ill, was a Unitarian and an awesome woman. In her early career, she was a teacher and author of children's books, but her unique and international role was an advocate for improvements in the treatment of patients suffering from mental and emotional disorders. They used to keep people in jail for these. She was one of the most visible humanitarian reformers of the 19th century. During the Civil War, she served as the superintendent of the United States Army Nurses. Patty Duke, actress, earning the Academy Award for The Miracle Worker, star of her own show, The Patty Duke Show, first woman president of the Screen Actors Guild. It's possible she was mistaken for a Unitarian because she became such a strong advocate for the LGBT community, which we have been always. And she purchased her ordination by mail from the Universal Life Church because she wanted to marry same-sex couples. Awesome gal. Jill Eikenberry, actress, breast cancer survivor, and activist, star of LA Law, many films, TV movies. Honestly, though she is listed as a UU in many places, I found nothing. So again, she probably signed a guest book or had a friend who was Unitarian or maybe a boyfriend, or who knows. Fanny Farmer grew up in a Unitarian family that valued education highly, even for girls. After suffering a paralytic stroke at the age of 16, she couldn't go to school anymore, so she took up cooking to pass the time. As an adult, she enrolled in the Boston Cooking School to learn about cooking and nutrition, and eventually rose to be the school's principal. She wrote multiple cookbooks, taught cooking and nutrition, and this is great. She is credited with creating the standardized North American measurements. So the next time you're baking a cake, you know, that cup and that teaspoon and so forth, thank a Unitarian. Greta Gerwig, and I love this. She is an American actress and playwright who was raised a Unitarian Universalist in Sacramento, even though she attended an all-girls Catholic school there. She wrote Lady Bird, which you've seen it, is a semi-autobiographical film, which garnered strong reviews and Oscar nominations. She followed this with a widely praised film adaptation of Little Women, about Unitarian Louisa Mallicott's Unitarian family. When you see her films, and when you read the book, Little Women, it's really easy to spot the Unitarian Universalism. And I have to say, even though I don't know about Greta's eating, the Alcotts were vegetarians, mostly vegan. I like to throw that in there because that's who I am. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, early 20th century Black author, poet, abolitionist, and women's rights advocate. Was born to free parents in Maryland, but conditions for free blacks deteriorated when the fugitive slave law took effect. So she moved north. She was prolific. She was a published author, a writer, a poet from an early age, addressing the moral uplift and freedom from oppression of marginalized people, all marginalized people. Doesn't that sound Unitarian? She also tirelessly helped slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. She worked for human rights, women's rights, temperance, and peace. She became involved in our Unitarian Universalist Church through her abolitionist work. But she remained involved in many ways throughout her life as an African-American Methodist Episcopal, the AME Church. Melissa Paris Perry is an American professor. That's not her. There she is. Author and political commentator with a focus on African-American politics. She hosted her own weekend news and opinion show, which I never missed, on television on MSNBC from 2012 to 2016. She is currently the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair at the Wake Forest University. Raised as a secular humanist Unitarian, which many of us were, she became a Christian Unitarian. In 2009, at our Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, Paris Perry gave the Ware Lecture, Faith and Reason, Race, Justice, and the American Political Life. It's online. It's awesome. If you become a member of UUFLB, you will receive a copy of the UU Pocket Guide, which she wrote the foreword. See, that's just another little perk of becoming a member here. Helen Hunt Jackson, American poet and activist, best known for her novel Ramona. I grew up with that novel under my pillow. I love that novel. It dramatizes the UU government's mistreatment of Native Americans in Southern California after the Mexican-American War. It has been reprinted more than 300 times. While she has been described as a transcendentalist author, I couldn't find any material which would show me any particular Unitarian Universalist or Universalist congregation as an adult. Julia Ward Howe, best known for her poem later set to music of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Also for her part in creating the Mother's Day for Peace, which along with two other women, mothers and daughters, both named Anna Jarvis, became our current Mother's Day celebration every year. Julia Ward Howe was born into a strict Episcopalian Calvinist family, but then she married a man who was a radical Unitarian. She and her husband attended the Church of Theodore Parker, a radical transcendentalist Unitarian thinker on human rights and slavery. Thousands of people attended Theodore Parker's services every Sunday. Michael Learned American actress, best known for her role as Olivia Walton in The Waltons. I love that show. I was so excited to see her in the various lists of Unitarian Universalists, but I found nothing to connect her to our faith tradition. But once, she wrote an article for the Unity Church, which is a Christian New Age, New Thought kind of a congregation, or faith tradition, which I thought was interesting. I still like her. Viola Liuzzo grew up in a poor family in the South, in the midst of racial segregation. As an adult, living in Detroit, she was active in the Unitarian Church there, which is a beautiful building. There's this huge, really historic building there. And she joined in local efforts for education reform and economic justice. When she saw what was going on with the civil rights movement in Selma and Montgomery, Alabama, and Martin Luther King asked for people of faith to come there and help, she did. She marched with thousands of others from Selma to Montgomery in support of civil rights. When she was driving a car full of people, mostly young African-American men, she was murdered by white supremacists. Marie Mitchell was the first American woman astronomer. She was the first professor of astronomy at Vassar College and the first director of Vassar's Observatory. Honored internationally, she was one of the most celebrated American scientists of the 19th century. Although they cherished the peacefulness and simplicity of the Friends, or Quakers, her family had long chafed under the puritanical Nantucket Quaker discipline. In 1843, she was interviewed by two women from her congregation. They reported, "We have attended to our appointment in the case of Maria Mitchell." You like her? She informed us she was not settled on religious subjects and had no wish to retain her right in membership, so she was disowned by the Quakers.
Oh, come on.
Seriously. Afterwards, until she left Nantucket more than 2 decades later, she attended our Unitarian Church, although she never became a member. Mitchell was an advocate in the women's rights movement. She encouraged her students to think of themselves as professional women. This may be my favorite line of the entire service. She said, "How many pulpits are open to women?" Florence Nightingale grew up in a wealthy British Unitarian family and went against their wishes by educating herself in the art and the science of nursing rather than just stay at home. As a nurse, she cared for those in poverty and became a leading advocate for improving medical care and more sanitary medical conditions. In addition to working as a nurse, she was a talented mathematician in the area of statistics and the use of the pie chart in a different way than it had been used before. It was used as a tool for determining social inequalities in the efforts towards social change. Mary Wright Ovington. Her grandmother attended a Unitarian church and her parents were members. They were supporters of women's rights and were involved in the anti-slavery movement. She was educated at Packer Collegiate Institute and Radcliffe. Ovington became involved in the campaign for civil rights in 1890 after hearing Frederick Douglass speak at the Unitarian Church and hearing Booker T. Washington speak at the Unitarian Universalist Church, or Unitarian Universalist Church of the Social Reform Club. She met Ida B. Well while taking Christmas presents to Ida's sister's children, and she was so appalled by the living conditions in the tenements that she became a fierce social reformer, a journalist, and she was a co-founder of the NAACP. Lydia Pinkham was a Universalist, though she was eclectic. She was a patent inventor, a businesswoman, an advertising writer, and an advice columnist. She was an inventor and a marketer of a famous patent medicine called Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound, one of the most successful products ever marketed for women. Her name and her picture were on the label of the product, so her products made millions of dollars. Her family were originally Quakers, but they left after a conflict over slavery. So she and her family became Universalists, and she was also a spiritualist. Sylvia Plath, poet, novelist, literary critic, novelist, diarist, correspondent, and sometimes social activist. On the evidence of her intensely professional poetry, Plath's personal theology was humanist, with a leaning toward nature mysticism. Throughout her short life, she was associated closely with the Unitarian Church. After her suicide, Plath was taken up as a martyr and a heroine of the feminist movement. She had always thought of herself as a pagan Unitarian Universalist. Beatrix Potter was a famous British Unitarian, author of Peter Rabbit. I bet all of us have seen Peter Rabbit, as well as many of her other children's story books. She was an illustrator as well and a conservationist. She had an avid interest in the natural sciences and became an expert on fungi. Known for her detailed scientific drawings of everything in the natural world. When she died, she left her property to the National Trust to ensure the conservation of the Lake District of England. Margaret Sanger was a Unitarian and a fervent birth control advocate. Her connections with the American eugenics movement and birth control movement of the 20s and 30s are undeniable. And they're also complex, contradictory, and highly contextual. I found what has been written about that to be very illuminating. Margaret Sanger and leaders of the birth control movement, predominantly women, believed that people should be empowered by education to make choices for themselves, to limit their own reproduction. In a society that frowned on an open discussion of sexuality and where physicians knew very little about the biology of reproduction, Sanger advocated that mothers be given access to scientific information needed to thoughtfully plan their conception. Other eugenic leaders, predominantly men, believed that the state should be empowered by statute to control reproduction by whole classes of people they deemed genetically inferior. Eugenicists focused on segregating the feebly inherited in mental institutions, ultimately seeking the legal remedy of compulsory sterilization. They also employed immigration restriction to limit the growth of certain population groups. Sanger, however, helped to establish 300 doctor-staffed medical clinics, and she was assisting in the founding of what we now know as Planned Parenthood. Lucy Stone was a Unitarian, a feminist, an abolitionist, a suffragette from a well-established New England family. She objected at an early age to assigning women an inferior role in the congregational church, and when she learned there that women were not able to vote at their meetings, well, she changed. When she married, Lucy decided to keep her own name. She and her husband led a protest against the marriage laws as part of their wedding ceremony. Now, I have done some interesting things in the early same-sex weddings, so I kind of resonate with that, but I thought that was pretty cool. She used her energy as a lecturer and an organizer in the movements for racial justice and women's rights as a Unitarian. Mary Wollstonecraft was a revolutionary advocate of equal rights for women, was inspiration for both the 19th century and 20th century women's movements. She wasn't just merely a women's rights advocate. She asserted the innate rights of all people, whom she thought were victims of a society that assigned people by their roles, their comforts, their satisfactions, according to false distinctions like class, race, age, or gender. Wollstonecraft was a congregant at the Unitarian Chapel at Newington Green, this is in England, where she entered a circle of intellectuals and radicals. She embraced a religion that combined faith and reason, morality with knowledge, and which placed no limits on human inquiry. Wollstonecraft is best known for A Vindication of the Rights of Women, a book that she wrote, in which she argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, that they appear to be only because of their lack of education. It just wasn't available to women at that time. She suggests that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagines a social order founded eventually on reason. Unfortunately, she died only 11 days after giving birth to her daughter, who was Mary also. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was the author of Frankenstein. So there you go. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was a novelist and dramatist, the daughter of feminist philosopher, educator, and writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Unfortunately, her mother died of fever soon after she was born. The T's and the blurb for the service, who's who, you, but I told you there'd be something that had to do with Frankenstein. Well, she was the author of the novel, the famous character of Frankenstein's monster, and it's influenced popular culture for more than 100 years. Emma Watson is an English actress and model known best for playing Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter movies. After acting in the film Noah, who some of you may have seen, which has been criticized about its faithlessness to the scriptural account of the flood, was asked about her faith. So she said, I already, before I did the movie, had a sense that I was someone more spiritual than specifically religious. I had a sense I believed in a higher power, but that I was more of a universalist. You see, I think that there's unifying tenets between so many of the religions. So as I said, some of the folks that we know as Unitarian Universalists from some list somewhere are not necessarily members of UU churches, but in this case, she was definitely a kindred spirit. And the last one is Joanne Woodward. And I'm glad that in coming to the end, I can tell you about this woman. Actress, producer, director, who earned the Academy Award for Three Faces of Eve in 1957, and 3 other nominations, 2 Emmys, and artistic director of the Westport County Playhouse and national trustee of the Nature Conservancy. She was, of course, married to the actor Paul Newman, and together they were social activists, as well as members of the Westport, Connecticut UU Church, where she is still a member today. They were Sunday school teachers, they worked in the kitchen, they helped out fixing the plumbing, they did everything that all of our UU members do in that congregation, plus they left a lot of money. He left a lot of money for the good works of that congregation. The minister today still has people coming in to see the pictures of Woodward and Newman on the wall of that congregation. It's a really cool building. If you ever go to Westport, Connecticut, it looks like something that's been dropped by aliens. This big, weird building that kind of has these blind buttresses going out everywhere. So, I'm delighted to know that there are those in all these lists who were clearly Unitarian Universalists, who were members of our congregation. But I'm glad that so many people were inspired by Unitarian Universalists and were somehow claimed by us as kindred spirits. And I'm so glad to claim all of the above women as our soul sisters. Amen and blessed be. Candy, if you could come up and extinguish our chalice.